And Amy, well, we talked about it briefly last hour. The 9/11 legislation that was passed by Congress did something they've never done before. They overrode a veto of the President of the United States.
It only took 7.5 years.
Yeah, this President of the United States. And they did so by an overwhelming margin, well more than the two-thirds required. And the president wasn't happy about it, suggested it's just election year politics. You don't want to be perceived as having voted against 9/11 families. And since he's a lame duck, not running for re-election, he can be perceived as being opposed to the interests of 9/11 families because there's nothing you can do to hurt him. For more on this and a few other geopolitical matters, we're happy to be joined again by Michael Rubin. Of course, Michael Rubin, AEI, American Enterprise Institute resident scholar, former Pentagon official. Michael, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dan.
So on the 9/11 legislation itself, let's dispense with the president's jawboning for a moment. There is some disagreement within Republican diplomatic circles. Ambassador John Bolton, former Attorney General Mike Mukasey wrote a joint op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago saying that it was a bad idea, that it would, the idea of piercing sovereign immunity for foreign governments with respect to private lawsuits, which is what this legislation would do, opens America up for retribution, and it's not worth the price to do this. What's your take on the judiciousness of the legislation that was passed and now will become law?
Well, you know what, Dan and Amy, what makes this so different from previous legislation is you could always sue state sponsors of terror. People could sue the Islamic Republic of Iran for terrorism. The Lockerbie families, for example, could sue Libya when it was a state sponsor of terrorism. What this legislation specifically has done is say you don't need that designation before you can sue a country for terrorism. And that's why officials whom I respect, like Ambassador John Bolton, are saying this is a really bad idea, on top of which there's no international definition of terrorism. It's like that famous Potter Stewart quote about pornography.
Mm-hmm.
I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. The point of this is that there may have been a better way to do this. If President Obama had used his executive authority to advocate on behalf of the 9/11 victims, instead of just kicking the can down the road to the judiciary, everything would probably have been a lot more solid.
Well, how will it expose, American diplomats overseas from reciprocal action by exposing them to private lawsuits in other countries? I mean, is that possible?
Well, part of this is that once you sue a state, you can put liens on their property. So, for example, if people sue Saudi Arabia, the victims of 9/11, for which Saudi Arabia was very culpable, were to win in the U.S. court, Saudi Arabia has a lot of property in the United States, and that property could be seized. Mm-hmm. What people are specifically afraid of is you have a lot of American property overseas. Would courts, and we don't trust a lot of overseas courts, be able to do this, for example, in Yemen, in Pakistan, or elsewhere? Then again, others can say this is a one-off issue with regard to Saudi Arabia, and if other states are trying to seize American property, why are we having embassies in those states in the first place?
Well, right, and so this also goes to perhaps the underlying philosophy behind the push for this legislation at this time, which is, isn't it about damn time that America reasserts herself in the world and stops considering herself exceptional like New Zealand considers itself exceptional in President Obama's famous formulation. And we're going to hold people and states and state actors responsible, and certainly allow the victims' families to do so through civil lawsuits, because we're going to use all means necessary to hold people accountable for acts of terrorism against the United States. What's wrong with that?
Well, I don't think anything's wrong with that, but I think the buck should stop in the White House in the Oval Office, and we shouldn't be deferring this to the presidency. I have a big problem with the state sponsor of terrorism list because after 9/11, for example, President Bush, by executive order, allowed the Treasury Department, in addition to the State Department, to designate terrorists. Now, if you compare the Treasury Department list and the State Department list, the Treasury Department list is about 30 times as long as it should be, because the problem with the State Department is it's too willing to play the diplomatic game and not call a spade a spade. So they're willing to say that countries like Pakistan or Turkey aren't engaged in terrorism, and we know that Pakistan supports the Taliban, if not Al-Qaeda, sheltered Osama bin Laden. Turkey supports the Islamic State. The fact of the matter is, in a situation like this, we should be dealing with reality, but it's the White House that needs to deal with reality instead of just kicking the can down the road to having every court get involved.
So when it comes to 9/11 family members who are seeking restitution against Saudi Arabia, now don't they have to wrangle in court for access to evidence?
Well, a lot of that evidence would be in the hands of U.S. authorities, would be in the hands of the executive. That's exactly what I mean. If we had the executive supporting this sort of issue, that would be quite positive. Now, when you go into a U.S. court, you have discovery and so forth. And so what a lot of people in the Pentagon specifically fear, that if the United States starts giving evidence over to the victims of terrorism, that you could have the lawyers for Saudi Arabia, or in the future for Pakistan, for Yemen, for Al-Qaeda sponsors say, we want access to this intelligence. And once you have that access to the intelligence, the whole reason why things are classified in the real world, it's not to avoid embarrassment for Hillary Clinton, it's to protect sources and methods. And so if you're starting to expose that we, for example, have a recording of a conversation that occurred and only two people were in the room, that's not the sort of evidence that you want to give Saudi Arabia.
Switching topics a bit, report yesterday that 600 more U.S. troops will be deployed to Mosul. This will be news to Hillary that we have troops on the ground in Iraq. But I wonder, is this just more kind of window dressing to stitch things together for another few months until this president leaves office?
Well, absolutely it is. And one of the issues, Hillary Clinton was wrong during the debate when she said that the United States needed to withdraw because the Iraqis wouldn't offer us immunity. I spoke to Prime Minister Maliki at the time, and he said, I offered the American troops immunity, and the State Department came back. Hillary Clinton came back and said, no, you have to get your parliament to pass it. So she was telling the Iraqis how to operate, and that was politically untenable. What Maliki specifically said is Obama and Clinton wouldn't take yes for an answer. Now, what's ironic about the 600 troops going into Iraq, which I don't think enough people are commenting on, is they have the same sort of immunity that was offered back then and rejected by the United States. Now we're embracing it. So surely there was a mechanism.
Very interesting. One other topic I wanted to get you to weigh in on, Michael Rubin, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and that's this latest, what appears more and more to be a terrorist attack on the homeland, the Turkish national who murdered 5 people at the mall in Washington State, and now there's blog posts that have pictures of al-Baghdadi and other evidence that at least points to ISIS inspiration, perhaps, for his murderous attack. And it just seems to me that we're very kind of blasé about this. I remember a time when if somebody opened fire in a mall and murdered 5 people, that would be national news, and we'd want to know every detail and what happened and what didn't happen and how could this guy fall through the cracks. And now it seems like from many of our elites and elite institutions, we get a bit of a shoulder shrug like we expected.
You're absolutely right, and it frustrates me. First of all, we're in a situation where the elites just don't want to identify things as terrorism. We've heard, for example, that a lot of the evidence with regard to the Orlando shooting and the motivations for the Orlando shooting were purposely withheld so that the government could say, we don't know what the motivation was. Maybe it was a hate crime against gays, when we now know, for example, that the motivation was terrorism, plain and simple, Islamist-oriented terrorism. The same thing is going on here. It's the job of our elected officials to protect the American homeland, to protect American citizens, and they seem to be much more concerned with political correctness than doing what's right.
He is Michael Rubin, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and former Pentagon official. Michael, always good to get your insights. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy. Have a great morning.
You too. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.